That Valentine's Day dinner cost me a 2-year relationship and nearly $150. But what it bought me? Freedom. And a clarity I hadn't felt in years. That night, driving home through the quiet streets of Austin, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief, like I'd just escaped something truly terrible. But to understand how I ended up sitting across from a woman who was expecting a proposal while I was planning a breakup, we need to go back a little. My name is Noah. I'm 32, and honestly, I never thought I'd be sharing a breakup story like this. This whole situation was so absurd, I still sometimes pinch myself. It started about 2 years ago, at my cousin Maya's wedding, a huge affair in downtown Austin with hundreds of guests. Open bar, a DJ who clearly loved the Cupid shuffle way too much. I was trying to dodge my aunt's inevitable "why are you still single?" questions when this absolutely stunning woman walked up next to me and ordered a vodka cranberry. Her name was Charlotte Hayes. She was 29, a marketing executive, and she had this incredible presence. When she walked into a room, heads just turned. We started talking. I made a few terrible jokes about the wedding cake, and she actually laughed. By the end of the night, we were dancing to songs we both secretly loved, pretending to hate them. It felt, honestly, like something out of a romantic movie. That first year with Charlotte was genuinely amazing. We traveled a lot, Denver, San Diego, even a long weekend in Seattle. We'd stay up late, talking about everything from philosophy to our favorite childhood cartoons. And the physical chemistry? Off the charts. She had this beautiful apartment in Clarksville with huge windows overlooking the city, and I had my place in Zilker. We didn't live together, but we were practically inseparable. Her friends loved me. My friends thought she was gorgeous and fun. My mom, well, she started dropping hints about grandchildren every Sunday dinner. Everything seemed perfect. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself, even as the first red flag started to flutter around our 1-year mark. I look back now and wonder, have you ever ignored warning signs in a relationship because you were just too invested, too hopeful, to see them clearly? The marriage hints started small. Instagram posts of engagement rings with captions like "just browsing." Or pointing out engaged couples in restaurants with this look in her eyes that made me uncomfortable. Then her best friend got engaged, and suddenly, every conversation was about weddings. She started buying bridal magazines, leaving them on my coffee table when she stayed over, always claiming it was just for fun. I tried to tell myself it was normal. We'd been together over a year, she was 29, of course marriage was on her mind. But it began to feel less like natural progression and more like a calculated campaign. The hints escalated into direct conversations. She'd ask when I thought people should get engaged, what kind of wedding I wanted, how many kids I saw myself having. And every time I tried to pump the brakes, to say I wasn't ready to think about that, her mood would just shift. Instantly. She'd go from happy and laughing to cold and distant in 5 seconds flat. Sometimes she'd tear up, saying I didn't take our relationship seriously. Other times, she'd just go silent and leave my apartment without a word. The really crazy part? The next day, she'd act like nothing had happened. Text me good morning with heart emojis, suggest dinner, as if we hadn't just had a massive fight. I started to see a pattern, emotional blow-up, make me feel like the bad guy, then a complete reset, expecting me to just move on without ever actually resolving anything. Her ex-boyfriend, Ethan, started coming up more frequently around month 15. At first, I thought she was just being open about her past. But then I noticed she only mentioned him when we were fighting about commitment. Ethan wanted to marry me, she'd say. Or, Ethan would have proposed by now. I'd just sit there, thinking how weird it was that she kept comparing me to a guy she supposedly didn't want anymore. I admit, I did some light social media stalking. I'm only human. Turns out, Ethan was this successful real estate developer, drove a nice car, wore expensive suits. He even still followed Charlotte on Instagram and liked most of her posts. The whole thing gave me this sick feeling. It seemed less like she was over him, and more like she was keeping him as a backup plan, just in case I didn't work out. Around month 18, things got worse. Charlotte started making wedding venue visits. She'd come back, full of stories about some beautiful barn in New Mexico or an elegant ballroom downtown. I felt like I was being pulled into a current I couldn't escape. One night, at her apartment, I finally tried to have an honest conversation. I said, "I care about you, but I'm not ready for marriage right now." She completely lost it. Crying, yelling that I was wasting her time, that she could be with someone who actually valued her, that her biological clock was ticking, and I was being selfish. I sat there on her couch, feeling like the villain in a movie I hadn't auditioned for. When I tried to defend myself, she just cried harder and said I didn't understand what it was like to be a woman approaching 30. The next morning, she texted me, "I'm sorry. I love you," and suggested brunch, like the fight never happened. That's when I finally understood, this pattern was never going to change. But I loved her, or at least I thought I did, so I just kept going, hoping things would magically get better. Incredibly stupid of me, looking back. Then came the night that changed everything. And honestly, I should have seen it coming. Charlotte had been extra sweet all week, cooking dinner, affectionate, not a single mention of marriage. I actually thought we'd turned a corner. It was a cold January night. We were eating spaghetti she'd made, sitting at my dining table. Everything felt comfortable, normal. Then she looked at me with this completely calm expression and said, "I need to tell you something important." My stomach immediately dropped. I knew whatever was coming wasn't good. Charlotte put down her fork, looked me straight in the eyes, still eerily calm, and said, "If you don't propose to me by Valentine's Day, I'm going back to Ethan." The whole room went silent. All I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I sat there, frozen, trying to process it. This wasn't a conversation or a discussion. It was an ultimatum, delivered like she was closing a business deal. The craziest part was how casual she sounded, like she was just telling me what she wanted for breakfast. She went on to explain that Ethan had been texting her, that he'd told her breaking up was the biggest mistake of his life, that he was ready to propose whenever she wanted. She said all of this while looking at me, expecting me to panic, to immediately pull out a ring. I could see in her face that she thought this was a brilliant strategy, that threatening to leave me for her rich ex-boyfriend would make me realize what I was about to lose and force me to commit. But instead, something completely different happened inside my brain. I looked at her, sitting there so confident, so satisfied with herself. And this wave of clarity washed over me. It was so intense, it felt physical. I realized this woman didn't love me. She was trying to trade me like a stock that wasn't performing well enough. The thought kept running through my mind, if someone really loves you, they don't threaten to leave you for someone else unless you marry them. They don't use another person as leverage to manipulate you into the biggest decision of your life. And they definitely don't set arbitrary deadlines like you're some kind of work project. I took a deep breath. "That's fair," I said. And I watched her face light up with this triumphant smile. She thought she'd won. She thought I was agreeing to her terms, that a proposal was now inevitable. She reached across the table, grabbed my hand, and started talking about how she knew I'd understand, how happy we'd be, how Valentine's Day would be perfect for an engagement. And I just sat there, nodding, while my brain was already 3 steps ahead, planning something completely different. The rest of dinner was surreal. She was chattering away about wedding ideas and honeymoon destinations, while I was having this intense internal conversation with myself about what I was actually going to do. Have you ever had a moment where you suddenly saw a situation with perfect clarity? Where all the confusion just evaporated, and you knew exactly what you had to do? I wasn't thinking about buying a ring. I was thinking about the fact that I'd just been given an ultimatum by someone who claimed to love me, and how fundamentally messed up that was on every possible level. The phrase that kept repeating in my head was, I wasn't being chosen, I was being forced, and once I thought that, I couldn't unthink it, because it was so obviously true. Charlotte didn't want to marry me specifically. She wanted to get married before she turned 30, and I was the guy who happened to be there. If I didn't comply, she had Ethan waiting in the wings like an understudy, ready to take my place. I realized that if I proposed under these conditions, I'd be walking into a marriage that started with blackmail. That would set the tone for the rest of my life. She'd know that threatening to leave me was an effective tool to get whatever she wanted. That night, after I drove home, I sat in my living room until 3 a.m, thinking through every possible outcome. I came to the conclusion I had to end this relationship. But I had to do it in a way that was clean and final. I knew Charlotte well enough to know that if I just broke up with her over text, or at one of our apartments, she'd cry, she'd manipulate, she'd promise to change. And I'd probably cave, because I'm not great with emotional confrontation. I needed to do it in a public place where she couldn't make a huge scene, somewhere neutral where I could say what I needed to say and then leave. And that's when the idea hit me. Valentine's Day was 3 weeks away. Charlotte was expecting a proposal at a nice restaurant. So, why not give her the nice restaurant and the public setting, just not the outcome she was anticipating? The more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. She'd be so focused on getting engaged that she wouldn't see the breakup coming. By the time she realized what was happening, it would already be done. Over the next 3 weeks, Charlotte was the happiest I'd ever seen her. She genuinely believed she'd manipulated me into proposing. And watching her walk around in this delusional bubble of confidence was almost sad. She got her nails done in this specific shade of pink she said would photograph well with a ring. She kept leaving little notes around my apartment with her ring size written on them, like I might forget. She told all her friends something big was happening on Valentine's Day. She bought a new red dress that probably cost $400. She even made a hair appointment at some fancy salon downtown for the morning of. Meanwhile, I was systematically removing myself from her life in ways she didn't notice, because she was too focused on her fantasy engagement. I took all my stuff out of her apartment over the course of 2 weeks, just a few items each time I visited, so she wouldn't get suspicious. I changed my Netflix password, my Amazon password, and made sure my name wasn't on anything of hers that could cause problems later. I called my buddy Liam, who's a lawyer, and asked him hypothetically if there was anything I needed to worry about legally. He told me as long as we didn't live together and didn't have any shared assets, I was fine. What a relief. The hardest part was booking the restaurant. I wanted somewhere nice enough that she'd believe a proposal was happening, but not so expensive that I'd regret spending the money when I broke up with her instead. I settled on this Italian place called Amore Trattoria in South Congress. White tablecloths, dim lighting, known for romantic dinners. When I made the reservation, the host asked if we were celebrating anything special. I just said, something like that, which felt darkly funny. I also told my brother what I was planning, because I needed someone to know in case Charlotte tried to spin some crazy story afterward. He thought I was insane, but also said if I was going to do it, at least make it memorable. I guess I took that to heart. The week before Valentine's Day, Charlotte was extra sweet and affectionate, probably to make sure I was still on board. She kept saying she couldn't wait for our special day with this knowing smile that, honestly, made my skin crawl. She had no idea I'd already mentally ended the relationship and was just waiting for the right moment to make it official. There was something almost peaceful about having made the decision. All the anxiety and pressure just evaporated. Valentine's Day finally arrived. Charlotte texted me early that morning, "Today is going to be perfect," with about 15 heart emojis. I just responded with a simple, "See you tonight," because I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want to tip her off. She spent the entire day getting ready. Spa, elaborate curls, that red dress, expensive heels. When I picked her up at 6:30, she looked absolutely stunning and completely convinced she was about to get engaged. The drive to the restaurant was torture. She kept talking about how romantic the night was going to be, how she'd always remember this day, how grateful she was that I'd finally come around to her timeline. I just gripped the steering wheel and focused on the road. We pulled up to Amore Trattoria. The valet took my car, and as we walked toward the entrance, Charlotte grabbed my arm and whispered, "This is perfect." And I thought to myself, she was right. It really was perfect. Just not in the way she imagined. The hostess led us to a corner table, probably the most romantic spot in the restaurant, with candles flickering and a perfect view of the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Charlotte was practically glowing with anticipation. She kept looking at me with these expectant eyes, like she was waiting for me to drop to one knee right there, before we even ordered drinks. I could see her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the menu, pretending to read it, though I knew she wasn't processing a single word. The waiter came over and took our drink orders. Charlotte got champagne, of course. I ordered a beer. I needed something to keep me grounded in reality while this whole surreal situation played out. When the waiter left, she reached across the table, put her hand on mine, and started talking about how long she'd been thinking about this moment, how she knew we were meant to be together, how Valentine's Day was always her favorite holiday. I just nodded along, mentally rehearsing what I was going to say. The appetizers came out about 15 minutes later, some fancy bruschetta that Charlotte barely touched, too nervous and excited. I ate mine slowly, because I knew that once these plates were cleared, everything was about to change. I waited until the waiter took away our appetizer plates and promised the main courses would be out in about 10 minutes. That's when I made my move. The timing needed to be perfect. I reached across the table and took both of Charlotte's hands in mine. Her eyes immediately filled with tears of joy. She thought this was it. This was the moment she'd been manipulating me toward for months. She was already starting to smile, that huge, engaged girl smile I'd seen on Instagram 1,000 times. I took a deep breath. "Charlotte," I said, "I need to tell you something important." She nodded enthusiastically, practically beaming, like, yes, yes, say it. "Ask me, I looked her right in the eyes. "I don't want to marry you. I never want to marry you. And this relationship is over." I watched her face go through about 5 different emotions in the span of 2 seconds. First, confusion, like she didn't understand the words. Then shock, as the meaning started to sink in. Disbelief, like surely this was some kind of joke. Then anger, as she realized I was completely serious. And finally, this raw devastation that almost made me feel bad, except I remembered why I was doing this in the first place. She pulled her hands away from mine like I'd burned her and just stared at me, her mouth open. For maybe 10 seconds, she didn't say anything at all, which was the longest I'd ever seen Charlotte go without talking. Then the questions started pouring out in this frantic stream. What did I mean? Was this because of the ultimatum? Was there someone else? I calmly explained that you don't threaten someone with their replacement if you actually love them. I told her that the moment she gave me that ultimatum about Ethan, she'd shown me exactly what I was worth to her. And that worth was conditional, came with a deadline, like a business contract. I said that marriage should come from love and mutual choice, not from blackmail and manipulation. And I refused to start a life with someone who'd already proven they'd use emotional pressure to get what they wanted. Charlotte's face went from pale to bright red. She started getting loud. Not quite yelling, but definitely loud enough that the couple at the next table glanced over with concern. She said I'd wasted her time, that I'd led her on, that I'd promised her a future. And I just sat there thinking about how none of that was actually true. I'd never promised anything except to be honest about my feelings. She accused me of planning this whole thing just to humiliate her. And honestly, she wasn't completely wrong. I definitely could have broken up with her at her apartment or somewhere private. But I also knew that doing it publicly meant she couldn't guilt me into staying or manipulate me with tears in the privacy of one of our homes. The waiter approached our table, looking uncomfortable. He could obviously tell something was wrong. He asked if everything was okay. I said we were fine and asked if he could bring out any dessert that might have been ordered ahead of time. Charlotte looked at me with this confused expression because she had no idea what I was talking about. But I had a strong suspicion, based on how confident she'd been, that something special was waiting in the kitchen. The waiter nodded slowly and disappeared back toward the kitchen, looking relieved to escape the tension. Charlotte stood up from the table. "You're going to regret this," she said, with a venom in her voice I'd never heard before. She grabbed her purse, and I could see her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. I assumed she was calling an Uber. No way she'd sit through dessert with me now. Have you ever made a decision that felt ruthless in the moment, but absolutely necessary for your future? She stood there next to the table for what felt like an eternity, probably waiting for her ride to show up. Neither of us said a word. There was nothing left to say. Then the waiter came back out, carrying a small plate with what looked like a custom chocolate dessert. As he got closer, I could see words written across the top in elegant white frosting. He set it down on the table, and the words, "Say yes," were staring up at both of us. The whole situation became so absurd, I almost started laughing. Charlotte had apparently pre-ordered this dessert weeks ago, probably right after she gave me the ultimatum, assuming I'd proposed during dinner, and that this dessert would be the perfect moment to celebrate our engagement. The waiter stood there, looking deeply confused about why a couple who was clearly breaking up had an engagement dessert. Charlotte's face went from angry to completely mortified as she realized what had just happened. I looked at the dessert, then at her, and said, "That's really something." I could see her trying to decide whether to run out of the restaurant immediately or stay and try to salvage some dignity. She chose to leave. She turned and walked as fast as she could in those expensive heels toward the exit. I sat there alone at the table, with this say yes dessert and the attention of half the restaurant on me. The waiter came back after a moment and asked if I still wanted the check. I said yes, and apologized for the scene. He actually laughed and said he'd seen much worse breakups during his years at Amore Trattoria, which made me feel slightly better. The bill came out to $147, which felt like a small price to pay for my freedom. I left a $40 tip. That waiter had definitely earned it. I drove home in complete silence. No music, no phone calls, just me and my thoughts, processing what had just happened. When I got back to my apartment, that overwhelming sense of relief just washed over me. Charlotte started texting me around 10 that night. First, angry messages about how I'd humiliated her in public. Then, sad messages about how we could work things out if I'd just listen. Then, threatening messages about how I'd ruined her life and everyone would know what kind of person I really was. I read the first 10 messages just to make sure there wasn't anything urgent. Then I blocked her number. I was done engaging with the drama and manipulation. I found out later, through a mutual friend, that Charlotte had told everyone I cheated on her, which wasn't true. But most of our mutual friends could see through her version of events because they'd witnessed her behavior patterns over the years. That same friend told me Charlotte had gone back to Ethan within a week of our breakup. Which honestly, just proved my point about her having a backup plan all along. She didn't need time to grieve or process. She just moved laterally to her next option, exactly like I predicted. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. I braced myself for more drama, but apparently, Charlotte was too busy with Ethan to keep focusing on me. My life slowly returned to normal over the next few months. I started going out with friends again without worrying about her reactions. I focused on my work. I even went on a few casual dates, though nothing serious. About 6 months later, that same mutual friend reached out and told me something that made the whole experience feel almost poetic. Apparently, Charlotte had pulled the exact same ultimatum move on Ethan. She'd given him a deadline to propose or she'd leave, probably using me, or some other guy, as the threat this time. And here's the kicker, Ethan broke up with her, too. Because nobody wants to be manipulated into marriage, regardless of how much they might care about someone. I never reached out to Charlotte again. And I never regretted my decision. Looking back, the only thing I regret is not ending it sooner, when the red flags first started appearing around that 1-year mark. The whole experience taught me something invaluable about relationships and self-respect that I wish I'd understood earlier. Someone who truly loves you will never force you to prove it on their timeline, with their conditions. And they definitely won't threaten to replace you if you don't comply with their demands. Walking away from manipulation is always the right choice. Even when it's hard. Even when you're invested. Even when everyone around you thinks you should just go along with it to keep the peace. There's a difference between compromise in a relationship and surrendering your agency. And I'd crossed that line so many times with Charlotte that I'd almost forgotten what healthy boundaries looked like. That Valentine's Day dinner cost me a 2-year relationship, but it bought me something infinitely more valuable, my self-respect. My freedom to choose a partner who wants to build a life with me, not someone who wants to force me into one. There's only one thing more expensive than leaving a toxic relationship, and that's staying in one, paying for it with years of your life you'll never get back. I'm grateful every day that I chose the cheaper option. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation where an ultimatum revealed a truth you needed to see?